Good morning, everybody. We are moving through a 3-week series in the Rector's Forum that we call Living Expectantly. It's an Advent theme of how we think about what is to come, what God is introducing in the world around us, and are taking time to focus on a modern-day prophet as we prepare for the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom in 2018. Daniel Amsler is teaching our installment today. He's one of Holy Communion's most popular teachers and one of those classes that I always end up listening to again in the recording because there's always so much buried into it, and I know he's got a great treat for us today. Daniel Amsler.
The first time I spoke here in the forum, after Sandy arrived, he asked me what I would like for a setup. I said, I just need a lectern and a mic, to which Sandy responded, "Oh, you're old school, huh?" He was at the time 31 years old, and I was 71 years old. I thought that would have been self-evident. Let the record show that today I have with me a computer with some bits in it planned to illustrate my talk. I have every confidence that something unwelcome will malfunction, leaving me scrambling. So if anybody here who's 20 years old or under sees this starting to wobble, come on up. My thanks to Matthew Arnhart, who put this together for me. Reaching into full-length sermons on YouTube to grab the few minutes I wanted. Sitting next to him working is like watching brain surgery at warp speed. When Ben asked me to speak at this forum on a facet of Martin Luther King in this series as we prepare for the commemoration of Dr. King's death, I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the texts, the biblical texts that Dr. King chose to preach on, and to wonder why he chose these texts, and to listen carefully to what he was trying to persuade his listeners to, and to ponder how these texts and these sermons may be relevant and timely for us today, something we need to listen to. A survey was taken a few years ago about Martin Luther King Jr. The majority of the respondents, incredibly, did not know that Dr. King was a clergyman. Dr. King said of himself, "In the quiet recesses of my heart, I am fundamentally a clergyman, a Baptist preacher." King's father was a preacher. His grandfather and his great-grandfather and his brother were all preachers. Today we will listen and look to parts of some of Dr. King's sermons. He was not your ordinary Baptist preacher. When we hear him again, we will remember the tenor of his voice, his cadence, his eloquence, his fervor. But most of all, we need to remember his ideas, his principles, his passions, his prophetic voice and life. I am asking you to wonder why he chose these texts and why he thought they needed to be preached to his day. And I am asking how these texts may be powerfully relevant for us. We will speak together in the course of this when we hear the excerpts, and I'll invite your responses. Sometimes when Dr. King says things in these sermons, they make me flinch. I suspect they will make you flinch a bit too. I can only conclude that the preacher is doing his or her job when that happens. First, a reminder snapshot of Dr. King. He was born in 1929 in Atlanta and lived to only 39 years of age. He was born Michael King. Following a trip to Germany in 1934, his father changed both his and his son's name to Martin Luther King after the great reformer. I understand that all of his life, his family called him Mike. I will not do so. King said his father regularly whipped him until he was 15 years old. When he was 6, he lost his best friend, a white boy. When they had to go to separate schools, and his friend's father no longer wanted the boys to play together. The young king was forever rocked by this. Though growing up in a home with a preacher father and a talented gospel musician mother, King had unrelenting doubts about Christianity as a child and an adolescent. A precocious student, King skipped both the 9th and the 12th grades of high school. During his junior year in high school, Morehouse College, the highly respected historically black college, announced that it would accept any high school juniors who could pass its entrance exam. It was World War II. Morehouse was looking to fill its classrooms, vacated by students who had enlisted. King passed the exam. The summer before his last year at Morehouse in 1947, the 18-year-old chose to enter the ministry. He concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer, in his words, an inner urge to serve humanity. He decided that he would be, in his term, a rational preacher. To read and listen to his sermons, as edifyingly I have been doing of late, you see that he preached and lectured with eloquent vocabulary, constant references to philosophers, poets, thinkers, and references and ideas that flowed from his seminary education, graduating first from Crozier Seminary in Chicago and his PhD in theology from Boston University. At age 25, in 1954, King was called to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus. The Montgomery bus boycott was born. Led by King, the boycott lasted for 385 days. King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. But as King said, I am fundamentally a clergyman, a Baptist preacher. And all of us would surely agree that he being dead yet speaketh, which interestingly enough is a phrase from the book of Hebrews chapter 11, a passage that we sometimes call the biblical hall of fame of the saints. All true for Dr. King. Last week, with Sandy's guidance, we walked through the extraordinary letter from the Birmingham jail. That was carefully written and an argued response to white so-called moderate clergymen. Through YouTube video, sometimes grainy and sometimes just audio, Dr. King is our guest preacher today. You can find these sermons with a Google search for Martin Luther King sermons on YouTube. There you will find excerpts and full-length sermons. A book of sermons entitled A Knock at Midnight has been a goldmine for me. This is wonderful reading with introductions by people who knew King well and descriptions of the settings where they took place. I will not talk too much today. We will let Dr. King speak for himself, and I invite you to respond to what you're hearing. He preaches essentially to black congregations in these sermons. We know the issues of 50 years ago that Dr. King led in addressing: injustice, racism, polarity, violence, poverty, war. At the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death, we are commemorating his life. I believe we are doing this to strongly ask ourselves as a congregation and as individuals, what will we be? What will we do with these challenges, issues that seem to still be very much with us? These sermons are live and emotional and intent on persuasion. I invite you to listen carefully to these words. They are not cautious, moderate words. The essential goal of preaching is to persuade. Listen to yourself as you listen to him to see how these words strike you, persuade you. Let's have a look and a listen. If the volume is too loud or too soft, give me a heads up so I can adjust it. This sermon we start with is called Moral Courage. It was given at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia, on November 5th, 1967. It is based on the Old Testament story of King Nebuchadnezzar's order to bow down and worship the golden idol that he'd made. Those who refused would be thrown into a fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do so. And in Dr. King's phrase, these men practice civil disobedience. They said, "O king, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up."
You know that I'm so glad, church, I got my religion. Hallelujah now.
Now the if faith says, if all goes well, if life is hopeful, prosperous and happy, if I don't have to go to jail, if I don't have to face the agonies and burdens of life, if I'm not ever called bad names because of taking a stand that I feel that I must take, if none of these things happen, then I'll have faith in God. Then I'll be all right. That's the if faith. There is a though faith, though. And the though faith says, though things go wrong,
Yes.
though evil is temporarily triumphant, though sickness comes and the cross looms, nevertheless, I'm going to believe anyway, and I'm going to have faith anyway. Though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. You ought to discover some principle.
Yes, sir.
You ought to have some great faith that grips you so much, you will never give it up.
Never.
Somehow you go on and say, I know that the God that I worship is able to deliver me. But if not, I'm going on anyhow. I'm going to stand up for it anyway. And I say to you this morning that if you have never found something so dear and so precious to you that you will die for it, then you aren't fit to live.
Make it plain.
You may be 38 years old as I happen to be. And one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls upon you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause. And you refuse to do it because you are afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you will lose your job, or you're afraid that you will be criticized, or that you will lose your popularity. Are you afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot at you or bomb your house? And so you refuse to take the stand. Well, you may go on and live until you are 90, but you're just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. You died when you refused to stand up for right. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice.
This is not the powerful, careful logic of a written letter from the Birmingham jail. This is the trumpeting Baptist minister. That should warm our hearts on a cold Memphis morning. Before I invite your responses, let's hear a second excerpt. This next clip is the longest. It does not have any changing images, just audio, so it requires some attending to. But I find it one of the most fundamental declarations that formed the core of Dr. King's ministry and work. It was delivered early in Dr. King's career at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Montgomery, Alabama, on November 17, 1957.
I want to use as a subject from which to preach this morning a very familiar subject, and it is familiar to you because I have preached from this subject twice before, to my knowing, in this pulpit. I try to make it something of a custom or tradition to preach from this passage of Scripture at least once a year, adding new insights that I develop along the way out of new experiences as I give these messages. Although the basic content is the same, new insights and new experiences naturally make for new illustrations. So I want to turn your attention to this subject, loving your enemies. It's so basic to me because it is a part of my basic philosophical and theological orientation, the whole idea of love, the whole philosophy of love. In the 5th chapter of the Gospel as recorded by St. Matthew, we read these very arresting words flowing from the lips of our Lord and Master. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Certainly these are great words, words lifted to cosmic proportions. And over the centuries, many persons have argued that this is an extremely difficult command. Many would go so far as to say that it just isn't possible to move out into the actual practice of this glorious command. They would go on to say that this is just additional proof that Jesus was an impractical idealist who never quite came down to earth. And so the arguments abound. But far from being an impractical idealist, Jesus has become the practical realist. And the words of this text glitter in our eyes with a new urgency. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. Yes, it is love that will save our world and our civilization. Love even for enemies. Now let me hasten to say that Jesus was very serious when he gave this command. He wasn't playing. He realized that it's hard to love your enemies. He realized that it's difficult to love those persons who seek to defeat you, those persons who say evil things about you. He realized that it was painfully hard, pressingly hard. But he wasn't playing. And we cannot dismiss this passage as just another example of Oriental hyperbole, just a sort of exaggeration to get over the point. This is a basic philosophy of all that we hear coming from the lips of our Master. Because Jesus wasn't playing, because he was serious, we have the Christian and moral responsibility to seek to discover the meaning of these words and to discover how we can live out this command and why we should live by this command. Redemptive, transforming power in the universe. So this morning, as I look into your eyes and into the eyes of all my brothers in Alabama and all over America and over the world, I say to you, I love you. I would rather die than hate you. And I'm foolish enough to believe that through the power of this love somewhere, men of the most recalcitrant bent will be transformed. And then we will be in God's kingdom. We will be able to matriculate into the university of eternal life because we had the power to love our enemies, to bless those persons that cursed us, to even decide to be good to those persons who hated us. And we even prayed for those persons who despitefully used us. Oh God, help us in our lives and in all of our attitudes to work out this controlling force of love and this controlling power that can solve every problem that we confront in all areas. Oh, we talk about politics. We talk about the problems facing our atomic civilization. Grant that all men will come together and discover that at the cross of Christ we will solve these problems. The international problem, the problems of atomic energy, problems of nuclear energy, yes, even the race problem. Let us join together in a great fellowship of love and bow down at the feet of Jesus. Give us this strong determination. In the name and spirit of this Christ we pray.
In my living with these sermons from Dr. King these past weeks, nothing has struck me more than this unwavering, endless commitment to teach and live love as the only transformative power. In this sermon, he also said, somebody somewhere must have some sense. Men must see that force begets force. Hate begets hate. Toughness begets toughness. And it is all a descending spiral, ultimately ending in destruction for all and everybody. Somebody must have enough sense and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate and the chain of evil in the universe, and to do that by love. What did you hear? How does it strike you? How does it persuade you?
And I'm struck by and impressed by the lack of rancor by the lack of rancor and anger in his voice from one sermon to 10 years later, to think what he had gone through in those years were just incredibly hard. But yet in the last sermon that we heard, there was still that hope and lack of anger and hatred.
I took note of the if-then faith that he discussed in the first clip. If these things happen, then I'll have faith. But then when those things don't happen, where's God? I thought God existed. I wonder if God doesn't exist because the experiences that I'm having are tough. And in pastoral care, your clergy encounter this a lot. How do we have faith in the midst of the hard times as well as in the midst of the good times? And I think he put that in very clear terms.
For me, I was 6 when King was killed, and my mother happened to be the second person that the mayor called to ask for help. And it was because she ran an organization for the children, the little girls that were in the area where the sanitation workers lived. And Mom worked alongside with Father Don Mowry. And so my memories as a little girl are all based in this love that he speaks of. And my mom didn't come home for days. I remember my grandmother being upset. And for me personally, I was not allowed to play in our living room because people would drive by and throw bricks through the window. And they had things painted on them like the N-word with lovers after it and all of that. And I just remember our family saying what a compliment with the wrong words. And so when I look at and in my training for things I do today, I know that energetically the word and the feeling of love is more powerful when they teach hostage negotiation. They don't teach get angry. That person gets with that person and expresses love. And having watched all of our white neighbors leave to go east to form schools that really, they felt a great need to baptize me within those schools a lot because people were really worried. But I keep coming back to this love, and that even though there was that need to be so passionate and to express this and to say no and to all of these other things that kept coming up, underneath all of that, there's never a doubt that love wasn't the foundation and that love isn't what leads us to peace. So that's what I go back to and just remember it so well in my home.
The young, angry people who were trying to influence Dr. King wanted him to give up his nonviolence. Forget about Gandhi. Love, hyperbole, never did.
In his What If sermon, I thought so much that he was preaching to himself, that he was saying what his core was and letting everybody know what it was, and he never deviated from it.
He sat one night in his house, coming home tired, went out to make a cup of coffee, and he was just in total despair. And he said he was just ready to give it up. And this happened to him. He suffered depression all of his life. But he said he had an encounter with Christ that night at the table that said, you have to keep going. Okay. The next sermon is entitled The Drum Major Instinct. It's based on the text from Mark 10, where James and John came to Jesus with a request. Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Dr. King characterized the request of James and John in this way. There is deep inside of all of us an instinct. It's a kind of drum major instinct, a desire to be out front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be first. It is something that runs the whole gamut of life.
But let me rush on to my conclusion because I want you to see what Jesus was really saying. What was the answer that Jesus gave these men? It's very interesting. One would have thought that Jesus would have condemned them. One would have thought that Jesus would have said, "You are out of your place. You are selfish. Why would you raise such a question?" But that isn't what Jesus did. He did something altogether different. He said in substance, "Oh, I see. You want to be first? You want to be great? You want to be important? You want to be significant? Well, you ought to be. If you're going to be my disciple, you must be." But he reordered priorities. And he said, yes, don't give up this instinct. It's a good instinct if you use it right. Yes. It's a good instinct if you don't distort it and pervert it. Don't give it up. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. That is what I want you to do. And he transformed the situation by giving a new definition of greatness. And you know how he said it? He said, "Now, brethren, I can't give you greatness. And really, I can't make you first." This is what Jesus said to James and John. You must earn it. True greatness comes not by favoritism, but by fitness. And the right hand and the left are not mine to give. They belong to those who are prepared. And so Jesus gave us a new norm of greatness. If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That's a new definition of greatness.
Some of you remember that this quote was carved on the King Memorial in Washington, D.C. I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness. The phrase is modified in this sermon in which the 39-year-old explained to his Atlanta congregation that he would like to be remembered, how he would like to be remembered at his funeral. He made the February 1968 sermon and was assassinated just 2 months later. The legendary poet and activist Maya Angelou was the most prominent of the dissidents who said the truncated version of the quote made Dr. King sound like an arrogant twit because it was out of context. In the sermon, King said, "If you can find someone to eulogize me when I die, at my funeral, tell them to be brief and not to talk about my awards. Tell them I tried to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and help the poor and to love people, even my enemies." He actually said, "If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter." What did you hear? How does it strike you? How does it persuade you?
I'm struck by like the power of you putting this in front of us in sort of the YouTube clip, that because we can hear directly from Dr. King, the distractions of, like the YouTube, the person can't seem to have the words. It doesn't matter because we've got the direct words of Dr. King. And so we don't have to be filtered because so much of our life and what we digest is filtered by other people. And it's wonderful that we get to make our own interpretation despite the distractions that others bring, and it's really powerful. So it's like, sort of the, is this passage of the Bible right? Is it not? We don't have to go through that exercise. We can go, wow, I get it, because I get it directly. That's where I'm thinking right now.
I guess good preachers just kind of put us into a reflection mood. On August 16, 1967, Dr. King gave a long address to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That civil rights organization that Dr. King and his dedicated associates had begun 10 years before, which still thrives to this day. At the conclusion of his address, which was entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" here is how Dr. King closed.
And if you will let me be a preacher just a little bit. One night a juror came to Jesus, and he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic. That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again. So I conclude by saying today that we have a task, and let us go out with a divine dissatisfaction. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until they live on the outskirts of hope, brought into the metropolis of daily security, let us be dissatisfied until slums are cast into the junk heaps of history and every family will live in a decent sanitary home. Let us be dissatisfied until the dark yesterdays of segregated schools will be transformed into bright tomorrows of quality integrated education. Let us be dissatisfied until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until every state capital be housed by a governor who will do justly, who will love mercy, and who will walk humbly with his God. Let us be dissatisfied until from every city hall justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when the lion and the lamb shall lie down together. And every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. Let us be dissatisfied until men will recognize that out of one blood God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power.
According to Dr. King, I think that we can safely say we have failed miserably as a society.
I've been thinking a lot about Sandy's talking about the privilege, not giving up voluntarily their privilege. And I've been thinking a lot about what are my privileges. You know, I own 2 homes. It seems excessive. It is excessive. But if we're a society based on love, why should the laws of the land benefit me who have 2 homes over someone who's homeless? Or, you know, hear in the news about, you know, not funding health insurance for children. But why should we get tax credits for sending kids to private schools? I mean, Bishop Curry talked about voting at the presidential election. He said, vote for the people who follow Jesus' tenements. Love your neighbor. And I find I have a lot more than I deserve or need. And, you know, my political agenda would be stop benefiting me and help the more vulnerable.
I was 12 and living in Memphis when Dr. King was killed. My father worked down in the medical center. And when everything blew up downtown, he was maybe 3 blocks away in the nearest only hospital in the area. So they were basically, the whole area was shut down. Nobody could get in, nobody could get out for days. Now, I went to a county school. I went to Germantown Elementary, which was fairly new at that time. I think it had been open maybe a year or so. There was a school, because we were talking about this at a family event recently, and there was a school down the road that was called Neshoba. I don't know anything particularly about it, except that we would drive by it. It was kind of off the road, and it was pretty old and dilapidated, and But the reason that I really got to know Neshoba was because it was closed when I entered 5th grade. And the teachers from Neshoba, or at least I know of 5 teachers from Neshoba, were transferred to Germantown. Now, I don't know where the students were for my 5th grade, but in 6th grade, all the students came to Germantown Elementary. And this was the year before you had Dr. King arriving, you had the garbage man strikes, you had the race riots, or anything. And so for me to be hearing about all the fighting downtown and the fact that, my mother was crying because she had no idea where my father was and no way to find out, was very strange to me because I had black teachers. I knew black people. They were in my classroom. And I know that, I'm in my 60s, so I know enough to know that things happened in this area. You were saying that we had failed miserably. Okay, I take exception with that because I worked in Foote Cleburne Homes as a white teacher in an all-black school, talking to black parents, and that wouldn't have happened when I was 10 or 11. You wouldn't have had that. You wouldn't have had well-to-do white people in this area that go down every day during the week and tutor voluntarily. I think sometimes we get lost in the fact that we are doing some things better. Not everything, but some. And I liked Sandy's column in the paper the other day when he said that it seems that the community is making it harder for us to have joint or community or blended events. And I think that's also a big mistake.
I'm reminded that those that would denigrate Dr. King or anybody that has a message they don't like is to look at their flaws. Oh, well, he says all this, but he had affairs. And so you see too much of, in my opinion, of dismissing people that have messages because you want to pick at the flaws they have.
Someone said they found it offensive that we were going to celebrate Dr. King's death. It's not celebrating, it's commemorating. And I think this all reminds me who this extraordinary person and what he gave to us we need to listen to again freshly and pay attention, because I think really, as I suggested, the issues and the challenges of his day are with us still, deep and wide.
Well, first of all, thanks be to God for this man. I mean, my God. Secondly, for me, his message resonates that these people are not the other. They're just like we are, made in the image of God. Amen.
I spoke to Daniel before he started, stating that I had lived in a rural area across the river in the Arkansas Delta at the time that King was assassinated. I was a senior in high school. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had seen crosses burned on yards. I had seen people, I lived with segregation. It was very open in the rural areas. There were white restrooms, black restrooms. There was white waiting rooms at the doctor's office. There were fountains at the courthouse that you couldn't drink out of. You weren't supposed to be friends with the people that weren't the same as you. That still lives over there, and it's very, very strong. It's very difficult to love people that you're threatened by. It's very difficult to show compassion for people that are competing for the low-level jobs of the people. Yes, that's wealthy people. That's people that, I'm not wealthy by any means. Please don't take that. But I have wealth in family, clothes, warmth, and a home. I still see poverty out there when I go to visit the country, like we see in third world countries. People that, yes, they have electricity now, but they don't have city water. They don't have restrooms. I mean, as in bathrooms. They take their bath in a number 3 wash tub. They heat their water on the stove. We still have many places where we need to improve. I can love my neighbors that are near me. Can I love my neighbors downtown? Can I eat with them? Can I share with them? I grew up in the country with these people that, I say these people, because they were different from us. They had nothing, and they looked for those who were trying to do ill for them for the comforts that they needed, and they're still not coming. That's all I got to say.
Well, let this be an encouragement for our conversation and our dialogue with each other that will go on with grace and love. It seems fitting that this time of sermon should be ended with a benediction. It seems right to have it come from Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This is familiar, it is vigorous, it is demanding, it is hopeful. And when it is finished, let us sit quietly for a moment to ponder what we have heard and to consider to what we have been persuaded.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Go ahead.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.